My name is Vivian Hale. I'm 36 years old. 4 months ago, I stood in a hotel ballroom in a navy dress I'd bought specifically for that night, watching my mother hand my sister a giant printed check with my name nowhere on it, for a lake house worth $1.5 million that my grandmother had already given to me 6 years earlier in a trust my mother didn't know existed. 240 guests were watching. My father was clapping. My sister was crying happy tears into a microphone. And I was sitting at a round table with a glass of champagne going warm in my hand, waiting. Because I knew what was in my purse. A woman I'd never met in that room, a lawyer named Grace Whitfield, was standing near the back exit in a charcoal suit with a leather folio under her arm, watching the clock on her phone. We had planned this down to the minute. My mother thought she was staging the biggest moment of her life. She had no idea she was about to become the punchline of mine. Before I take you back to how we got to that ballroom, if you're new here, do me a favor and hit subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like this one. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. Now let me take you back 9 years, to a screened-in porch on Miller's Ridge, the summer my grandmother first told me the truth about the lake house and about my family. I need you to understand Bellhaven before I explain anything else. It's a town of about 6,000 people in upstate New York, the kind of place with one diner, one hardware store, and a lake that everyone in 3 counties calls the lake like there's only one, even though technically there are 4. My family has lived there for 4 generations. My great-grandfather built the original cabin on Miller's Ridge with his own hands in 1951. My grandfather, Walter Hale, expanded it in the 80s into what everyone in town just called the Hale House, 6 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a dock that my grandfather rebuilt every spring after the ice took its toll. My grandmother, Eleanor, ran that house like a ship captain. She kept the linens folded by size in a cedar chest. She kept a leather guest book by the door that dated back to 1962, and she made every single person who ever stayed there sign it, family or not. She had this way of looking at you when you walked in the door, this quick, sharp scan, like she was checking to see if you'd earned your place there that summer. My mother, Marlene, is Walter and Eleanor's only daughter. She married my father, Gerald, when she was 22, and they settled 40 minutes from the lake house in a split level in a subdivision that always smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass because my father mowed obsessively, like the lawn was the one thing in his life he could fully control. I was born first. My sister Chloe came 3 years later. Here's the thing about growing up second-born favorite in a house where the older kid is expected to be invisible unless she's being useful. You learn the math early. I was the responsible one. I got straight A's without anyone asking. I babysat Chloe for free starting at age 9 because my mother said that's what big sisters do. I never asked for a school trip or new sneakers because I already knew the answer before I opened my mouth. Chloe got dance lessons, then gymnastics, then a car for her 16th birthday, a white Honda with a bow on the hood in our driveway, while I was upstairs studying for the SATs in a bedroom with a radiator that clanked all winter. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for 12-year-old me. I'm telling you because you need to understand the arithmetic of that house to understand what happened in that ballroom decades later. In my family, love was distributed like a budget, and Chloe was always the line item that got funded first. But the lake house was different. The lake house belonged to Grandma Eleanor and Grandpa Walter, and at the lake house, the rules were theirs, not my mother's. And Grandma Eleanor never once looked at me like I was invisible. The summer I turned 14, my grandfather taught me to varnish the dock boards, one at a time, showing me how to feather the brush strokes so you didn't leave lap marks that would peel by August. My grandmother taught me how to can tomatoes from the garden, how to read the sky for weather before the radio ever caught up, how to fold a fitted sheet so it actually looked like something instead of a wrinkled ball shoved in a drawer. Chloe came up on weekends sometimes, got bored within an hour, and asked to be driven back to a friend's pool party. Nobody minded. That was just Chloe. I came up every single weekend from May to September for 8 straight years. I mowed the lower field. I helped my grandfather patch the roof the summer I turned 16, both of us up there with a bucket of tar and a transistor radio playing static-laced country music. I sat with my grandmother on the porch in the evenings while she read, and I did homework. The lake turning that particular shade of orange gold, it only turns for about 20 minutes right before the sun drops behind the tree line. This house is going to need someone who actually loves it, Vivian, my grandmother told me one August evening, not looking up from her book. Not someone who loves what it's worth. Someone who loves what it is. I didn't understand what she meant then. I understood it completely 9 years later, standing in a ballroom watching my mother point at a screen with a photo of that exact porch on it, telling 240 people it was a gift she was giving to my sister. I went away to college on a partial scholarship and worked 2 jobs to cover the rest, because when I asked my parents about tuition help, my mother said, and I remember this word for word because I wrote it down that night in my dorm room, "Vivian, you've always been so capable. We're saving for Chloe's wedding fund, honey. You understand." I was 19. Chloe was 16 and hadn't even had a first date yet. There was already a wedding fund. I met Theo Marsh my junior year in a shared elective on structural design, back when I still thought I might go into architecture before I pivoted into operations management. He was quiet in the way that people mistake for shy until they realize it's actually just economy of words, everything he said carefully chosen, nothing wasted. His father ran a small machine shop outside Rochester. His mother had passed when he was 19. He didn't come from money, and he never pretended to. What he had instead was this quality my grandmother would have recognized immediately, a person who showed up every time, without being asked twice. I brought him to the lake house the summer after we graduated. My grandfather shook his hand and immediately put him to work rehanging a screen door, which was, in Hale family currency, the highest compliment my grandfather knew how to pay a person. My grandmother watched them from the porch, and later that night, drying dishes together in the kitchen, she said to me, quietly, "That one stays." Like it was already decided. Like she'd been waiting for someone like him to walk through her door for a long time. I brought Theo to my parents' house the following month. My mother served a lasagna she'd clearly made from a box mix and dressed up, and she spent the entire dinner asking him questions about his 5-year plan in a tone that made it very clear she was auditioning him for a role he hadn't applied for. My father asked him what his father's shop was worth, which is a genuinely strange question to ask a person you've known for 90 minutes, and Theo, to his credit, just said, "Enough to keep the lights on and put food on the table." That's always been enough for us. My mother's smile got a little tighter after that. We got married 3 years later, a small ceremony at a vineyard 40 minutes outside Belhaven, 60 guests, string lights, a band that was really just 3 of Theo's college friends who happened to be decent musicians. My mother cried during the toast about how proud she was, and I believed her, mostly because at that point in the story, I still believed the good version of my mother was the real one, and the other version was just stress, just Chloe being a lot, just circumstances. Grandma Eleanor passed away the winter I turned 28. It was quick, a stroke, no long goodbye, no chance to sit with her on that porch one more time and ask her all the questions I didn't know yet that I'd want answered. The funeral was on a gray Tuesday in February, and half the town showed up because that's what happens when you've lived somewhere for 60 years and treated everyone in it like they mattered. At the reception afterward, in the church basement with the folding tables and the casserole dishes with masking tape names on the bottom, I watched my mother work the room like it was a campaign event, and I watched my sister accept condolences with a practiced, photogenic sadness that I found, even in my grief, faintly nauseating. Nobody asked me how I was doing. I stood by the coffee urn holding a paper plate of ambrosia salad I never ate, and I thought about my grandmother's hands, how they always smelled like dish soap and cedar, and I let myself cry in the one corner of the room where nobody was looking. My grandfather Walter lived another 4 years after that, alone in the lake house, refusing every suggestion that he move somewhere smaller, somewhere closer to town. I drove up every other weekend. Theo came with me most of the time. We fixed what needed fixing. We sat with him on the porch. My mother visited maybe once a month, always for an hour, always managing to mention, somewhere in the conversation, how much the property taxes on a place like that must be costing him, how a smaller condo would really be so much more sensible at his age. My grandfather passed in his sleep the spring I turned 32. Another funeral, another gray day, another round of folding tables. This time, when my mother stood up at the reception to speak, She said something that I filed away without fully understanding its weight yet. She said, "Now the family can finally decide what to do with the lake house together. Together." As if it were suddenly, conveniently, hers to decide. I want to pause here because I know some of you are already anticipating where this goes, and I want to walk you through it slowly, the way it actually unfolded, because the slowness is the whole point. Nothing about what my mother did was sudden. It took years. It just took me a long time to see the shape of it. 3 weeks after my grandfather's funeral, I got a call from a woman named Grace Whitfield, introducing herself as the attorney who had handled my grandparents' estate planning for the last several years. She asked if I could come into her office in Rochester, alone, at my earliest convenience. There were things I needed to know, she said, before certain conversations happened within my family. I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot outside her office building for a full 5 minutes before I went in because something in her voice on the phone had told me this was going to change things. Grace Whitfield's office looked exactly like you'd expect a good estate attorney's office to look. Warm wood, an actual physical library of thick binders, a framed photo of 2 golden retrievers on her desk that somehow made her more intimidating rather than less. She was maybe 55, silver-streaked hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed up on her head that she put on and took off constantly, like punctuation. "Your grandmother came to me 9 years ago," Grace said, opening a folder on the desk between us. "Not your grandfather, initially. Your grandmother. She sat exactly where you're sitting, and she told me she wanted to protect the lake house from what she called, and I'm quoting her directly, my daughter's arithmetic." I felt something in my chest tighten. "She set up an irrevocable trust," Grace continued. "The Miller's Ridge Family Trust. The property, along with an investment account she and your grandfather had built up over the years, roughly $1.5 million in combined value at today's assessment, was transferred into that trust 9 years ago. You were named the sole beneficiary. Your grandfather amended the trust and reaffirmed it 4 years later, after your grandmother passed, adding a clause that specifically named you and your husband as joint successor trustees upon his death, which, as of 3 weeks ago, is now. I sat very still. My mother doesn't know about this. No, Grace said. She does not. Your grandmother was very specific that this remain private until, in her words, the right moment reveals itself. Your grandfather agreed with her completely. He told me, the last time I met with him, that he expected your mother to try to distribute the property herself at some point, likely in some kind of public setting, because that was, and again I'm using his words, Marlene's way of making sure nobody could push back. I want you to sit with that for a second, the same way I had to sit with it in that office. My grandparents didn't just leave me the lake house. They anticipated exactly what my mother would try to do with it, and they built a wall around it years in advance, quietly, patiently, while I had no idea any of this was happening. Why didn't they just tell me? I asked. Grace took her glasses off, folded them, set them down. Your grandfather said something I wrote down, because I thought you might ask that exact question one day. She flipped a page in her notes. He said, if Vivian knows too early, she'll spend years trying to smooth it over with her mother instead of living her life. Let her live first. We'll make sure the paperwork's ready for whenever Marlene shows her hand. I didn't cry in that office. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect the dramatic collapse in these moments, and that's not what happened. What happened instead was that something in me went very quiet and very clear, the way a lake goes still right before the light changes. I thanked Grace. I asked what I needed to do next. She told me the trust was already fully executed, the deed already recorded at the county clerk's office under the trust's name, everything airtight, nothing left for me to sign except an acknowledgement of receipt, which felt less like paperwork and more like a formality confirming something that had already been decided for me by two people who loved me enough to plan 9 years ahead. There's one more thing, Grace said as I was gathering my things. Your grandmother left a letter. She asked me to hold it until the estate settled fully. I think that time is now. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten in her small, tidy cursive, the same handwriting from 60 years of guest book entries. I won't read you every word of it because some things I'd rather keep between us, her and me. But there was a line near the end that I've thought about nearly every day since. She wrote, "Your mother learned somewhere along the way that love is a thing you divide up and hand out strategically, like rationing during a war. I don't know who taught her that, and I stopped trying to fix it a long time ago. But I will not let her teach it to you, through what's left of this family's roof over your head." The house was never about the house, Vivian. It was about someone finally choosing you first without conditions. Consider it chosen. I sat in my car in that parking lot for a long time after I finished reading it. Then I drove home and told Theo everything, and he listened the way he always listens, completely without interrupting, and when I finished he just said, "So what do we do with it?" "Nothing yet," I said. "We wait." If this story is already hitting close to home for you, if you've ever had a family member quietly decide what you deserve without asking you, go ahead and drop a comment below. I read every single one, and I promise you, more people carry this than you'd ever guess from the outside. And if you haven't yet, this is a good moment to hit that subscribe button, because what happens over the next 4 years builds directly into that ballroom. For the next several months after my grandfather's death, my mother behaved exactly the way Grace had predicted. She began referring to the lake house in conversation as the family asset, a phrase she'd clearly practiced, the same way she'd practice a toast before a dinner party. She brought it up at Sunday dinners. She brought it up at my cousin's baby shower, cornering an aunt by the punch bowl to discuss, and I'm quoting her here because my aunt later repeated it to me almost verbatim. What's fair, going forward, now that Dad's gone? What she never once did, in all of that, was ask me a single question about what I wanted, or what I remembered, or what those summers meant to me. She talked about the lake house the way you talk about liquidating a stock position. Square footage. Lake frontage value. What a developer might pay for the land alone if the house came down. She never once mentioned the guest book, or the dock my grandfather rebuilt every spring, or the porch where Grandma Eleanor told me, without ever quite saying it outright, that she trusted me more than she trusted her own daughter. Chloe, for her part, had recently gotten engaged to a man named Preston, who worked in commercial real estate and who I will admit had a way of looking at any piece of property, including, apparently, our dead grandparents' lake house, like it was a line item on a spreadsheet he was mentally drafting. My mother adored him instantly, the way she'd always adored anyone who could talk confidently about money. I started noticing a pattern over those next few years, the kind of pattern you only notice in hindsight, once you already know how the story ends. My mother began asking me for things, small things at first. Could Theo and I help cover the deposit on the venue for Chloe's engagement party, just as a loan? She'd pay us back eventually. Could I help smooth over a dispute with the property tax assessor's office on the lake house, since I knew the place better than anyone? Could we help with a plumbing repair at the lake house that spring for $1,000, because it's not fair to ask Chloe and Preston to cover something they're not even living in yet? I paid for all of it. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters to understanding why the ballroom hit as hard as it did. Over those 4 years, Theo and I quietly put close to $60,000 into maintenance, taxes, and repairs on a property my mother did not yet know belonged to me, because I still believed, somewhere under all of it, that showing up financially might eventually translate into being seen. It didn't. It just became the new baseline expectation. Nobody ever thanked me twice for the same thing. They just moved the goalposts forward and waited for the next contribution. Grace called me periodically during those years, mostly just to check in, sometimes to update me on the trust's paperwork, the annual filings, the modest returns on the investment portion. During one call, about 18 months before everything came to a head, she said something I've never forgotten. "Your mother has been asking around town about probate timelines for your grandfather's estate. She doesn't know it's already settled through the trust. She thinks there's still something left to divide." "What do I do?" I asked. "Nothing," Grace said. "Let her keep asking. Let her build whatever plan she's building. When she moves, we'll be ready to move faster." Chloe and Preston's wedding came and went, a lovely, expensive affair that my mother paid for almost entirely, though I later learned through my aunt that a not insignificant portion of that money had, in fact, come from a loan my parents took out against their own house, a loan they were still paying off. I attended. I smiled. I gave a toast that was warm and genuine because I do actually love my sister, even when I resent the way our family has always treated her differently than they've treated me. That distinction matters to me, and I want to be clear about it here. This story isn't really about Chloe. Chloe was, in many ways, as shaped by my mother's arithmetic as I was, just shaped in the opposite direction. She grew up believing she was owed things. I grew up believing I had to earn everything twice. Neither of those is a healthy way to raise a child, and neither of us fully chose it. But my mother chose what she did next. That part is entirely hers. About 6 months before the ballroom, my mother started planning what she called a legacy celebration, ostensibly to mark what would have been my grandparents' 60th wedding anniversary, and to celebrate, in her words, everything Mom and Dad built for this family. She rented the largest ballroom at the Wynmore Hotel outside Rochester, hired an event planner, sent out 240 engraved invitations to family, old friends of my grandparents, half the population of Belhaven who'd known Walter and Eleanor for decades. I remember opening my invitation and feeling a strange, low hum of unease before I could even articulate why. I called my mother to ask what the event was actually for, beyond the general framing, and she was breezy, evasive, the way she gets when she's already decided something and doesn't want to discuss the decision, only the execution. It's a celebration, Vivian. Don't overthink it. Just come and bring Theo, and wear something nice. I told Grace about the invitation the next day. She was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then she said, "I think this is the moment your grandfather was talking about." We started preparing. Grace pulled the full trust documentation together into a single, clean packet, the original 2016 trust instrument establishing my sole beneficiary status, the 2020 amendment naming Theo and me as successor co-trustees, the recorded deed from the county clerk's office showing the property title held by the Millers Ridge Family Trust, and a formal letter, on her firm's letterhead, summarizing all of it in plain language for anyone in that room who might need it explained slowly. She also, at my request, agreed to attend the event in person. I told her I didn't know exactly what my mother was planning, but I had a strong instinct, and Grace, having read my grandparents better than almost anyone outside the family, agreed with that instinct completely. If she's going to try to give that house away in public, Grace said, then the correction should happen in public too. Quietly, cleanly, but in public. Your grandparents didn't build this protection, so you could enforce it in a private phone call nobody else ever hears about. I spent the 2 weeks before the event in a strange, suspended state, going through my regular life, my job, dinners with Theo, all of it, while carrying this enormous, unexploded certainty underneath everything. I didn't tell my mother anything. I didn't tell Chloe anything. I didn't even tell most of my extended family because Grace and I agreed the element of surprise was, frankly, the entire point. My mother had spent years managing every room she walked into, curating exactly what people saw, and when they saw it. This was the first time in longer than I could remember that I was the one holding information she didn't know I had. The night of the event, Theo and I arrived at the Wynmore a little before 6. The ballroom looked genuinely beautiful, I'll give my mother that. String lights across the ceiling, a wall of framed photographs spanning 60 years of my grandparents' lives, round tables with white linens and centerpieces of hydrangeas that I recognized, with a small ache, as the exact flower my grandmother grew along the fence line at the lake house. My mother had clearly put real effort and real money into this evening. Whatever else she is not lazy. I found our assigned table, near the front, close enough to the small stage that had been set up for what the event planner had called the toast segment. Grace arrived about 20 minutes after us, dressed simply, blending in easily among the older relatives and family friends, taking a seat at a table near the back exit where she had a clear line of sight to the stage. She caught my eye once across the room and gave me a single, small nod. Not yet. Dinner passed in a blur of small talk and old family friends telling stories about my grandfather's fishing exploits and my grandmother's legendarily strict opinions about proper table settings. My father gave a brief, sweet, slightly awkward toast about how much he missed his in-laws, and I found myself, despite everything I knew was coming, genuinely moved by some of it. Grief doesn't cancel itself out just because betrayal is also in the room. Both things were true that night, and I let them both be true. Then the lights dimmed slightly, A spotlight came up on the small stage, and my mother walked up to the microphone in a champagne-colored gown, looking every inch the woman who had spent 6 months orchestrating this exact moment. "Thank you all so much for being here tonight," she began, her voice carrying that particular warmth she reserves for audiences, a warmth I had spent 36 years learning was reserved almost exclusively for public consumption. Tonight isn't just about celebrating my parents' legacy. It's about honoring that legacy the way I know they would have wanted, by keeping this family's roots alive for the next generation. She gestured toward the screen behind her, and a photo came up. The lake house, the exact angle you'd see driving up the gravel road. Golden late afternoon light hitting the porch. A soft, appreciative murmur went through the room. I felt Theo's hand find mine under the table and hold it. "As many of you know," my mother continued, "the Hale family lake house has been in our family for over 70 years. And as the next chapter of this family begins, with Chloe and Preston expecting their first child this spring," here the room actually gasped a little, because apparently this was also the pregnancy announcement, layered into the same moment, a detail I hadn't been told either. "Gerald and I have decided there's no better way to honor my parents' memory than to make sure that house stays exactly where it belongs. In this family, with the next generation growing up in it." She turned toward the table where Chloe sat, glowing, clearly having been let in on this beforehand, Preston beside her already reaching for his phone to record. "Chloe, sweetheart. Preston, come on up here." They walked up to the stage together, Chloe already crying the specific, camera-ready tears she'd perfected somewhere around age 14. The event planner appeared from stage left carrying a large, printed novelty check, the kind you see at charity fundraisers, except instead of a dollar amount, it read, in elegant script, "The Hale Family Lake House, Miller's Ridge. Yours with love, Mom, Dad." 240 people applauded. Someone near the back actually cheered. My mother beamed, handed the giant check to Chloe with both hands like she was passing down a crown, and said into the microphone, loud enough that every corner of that ballroom heard it clearly, "This home, and everything it represents, now belongs to you and your growing family." I sat perfectly still at my table. Theo's hand tightened around mine. Not once, in the entire speech, had my mother said my name. Not once had she acknowledged that I was the person who had spent every weekend of 8 summers at that house learning how to keep it alive. Not once had she mentioned the $60,000 in repairs Theo and I had quietly paid for over the last 4 years to keep the roof from leaking and the pipes from freezing in the exact house she was now presenting, with theatrical flourish, as a gift she had the authority to give. I looked toward the back of the room. Grace was already standing, folio in hand, moving calmly and unhurriedly toward the small set of stairs at the side of the stage. I want to pause the story right here for a second, because I know a lot of you are white-knuckling your phones right now waiting for what happens next, and I promise you, we're getting there. But first, if you've ever watched someone give away something that was never theirs to give, something that actually belonged to you, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one of them, and honestly, this part of the story is the part one get the most messages about. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a genuinely good time, because the next 4 minutes of that ballroom are the reason I'm telling you this story at all. I stood up from my table. I didn't rush. I want you to understand that, because I think the pacing of what happened next mattered as much as what was actually said. My mother had spent 36 years teaching me that composure was a form of power, that the person who kept their voice level in a room full of shouting was the person who actually controlled the room. I walked toward that stage the same way I would walk into a quarterly review meeting. Steady, unhurried, prepared. Grace reached the base of the stairs at almost the exact same moment I did. She looked at me once, a quiet question in her eyes, and I nodded. Together, we climbed the 3 steps up onto the small stage, into the spotlight, in front of 240 people who had just finished applauding my mother's performance. My mother's smile faltered the second she saw me approaching with a stranger in a charcoal suit carrying a leather folio. "Vivian, honey, we're just finishing up the toast segment. Why don't you?" "I think everyone should hear this too, Mom," I said, and I took the microphone gently from her hand. She let me take it mostly, I think, out of pure surprise. The room had gone quiet in that specific way a room goes quiet when it senses something is about to happen that wasn't on the printed program. "This is Grace Whitfield," I said, gesturing to her beside me. She was my grandparents' estate attorney for the last 9 years of their lives. I'd like her to explain something to everyone here because I think there's been a misunderstanding about what my mother just gave away. A ripple went through the crowd. My mother's face had gone very still, the champagne-colored smile frozen in place like a mask she'd forgotten to remove. Chloe, still holding the giant novelty check, looked between me and our mother, visibly confused, the celebratory glow draining slowly out of her expression. Grace stepped forward, opened her folio, and spoke in the same calm, clear, unhurried voice I imagined she'd use in front of a judge. 9 years ago, Eleanor Hale came to my office and established what's called an irrevocable trust, naming her granddaughter Vivian as the sole beneficiary of the Miller's Ridge property and its associated accounts. That trust was reaffirmed and expanded by Walter Hale 4 years ago, formally naming both Vivian and her husband as successor trustees. The property title has been legally held by that trust, recorded at the Monroe County Clerk's office, for the last 9 years. She reached into her folio and held up a single document, the recorded deed, county seal visible even from a distance under the stage lights. This home has not belonged to Marlene or Gerald Hale at any point during that time. It has never been theirs to give away. The silence that followed lasted, by my count, a full 6 or 7 seconds, which in a room of 240 people feels considerably longer than it sounds. My mother's face cycled through something I can only describe as a system error, confusion, disbelief, and then, fast on its heels, that particular brand of controlled fury she reserves for moments when she's been caught in front of an audience she cannot afford to lose. That's not. This is a family celebration. This is completely inappropriate. We can discuss whatever paperwork confusion there's been privately. There's no confusion, Mrs. Hale, Grace said, her voice never rising, never sharpening, just remaining level and factual in a way that somehow cut deeper than shouting would have. The trust has been active and fully executed for 9 years. I have copies of the relevant documents here for anyone who'd like to review them. Chloe was still standing there holding the giant novelty check, and I watched in real time the exact moment she understood what it actually meant. Her arms lowered slightly, the cardboard check drooping, and she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since we were kids, something almost like the old, uncomplicated version of my sister, before all of this arithmetic had calcified into who she'd become. "Viv," she said quietly just to me, though the microphone was close enough that some of the room still heard it. "Did you know about this?" "I found out 4 years ago," I said. "Grandma set it up 9 years ago, before she died. She never told me either. She wanted to make sure everything was airtight first. So this house," Chloe said slowly, looking down at the cardboard check in her hands like it had suddenly become very heavy, "was never actually Mom's to give me." "No," I said. "It wasn't." My father, who had been sitting frozen at the head table through all of this, finally stood up. He didn't come to the stage. He just stood there at his seat, and I watched him look at my mother with an expression that told me this was, in fact, news to him too. Whatever else was true about my father's decades of conflict avoidance, and there is plenty to say about that on another day, he had not, at least, been complicit in this specific plan. "Marlene," he said, quietly enough that I only caught it because the room was so silent by then, "did you know it wasn't ours to give?" My mother didn't answer him. She was looking at me, and something in her face had shifted from fury into something closer to panic, the look of a person watching a story she'd spent years constructing collapse in real time in front of the exact audience she'd built it for. "This is a misunderstanding," she said again, louder now, trying to reclaim the microphone, though I didn't hand it back. "Vivian, we can sort this out as a family. This isn't the place." "You made it the place, Mom," I said. "You put a giant check on a stage in front of 240 people for a house that's been legally mine for 9 years. I'm not the one who decided this needed an audience. I want to tell you that the room erupted into gasps and drama, the way it might in a movie, but real life rarely does that. What actually happened was quieter, and somehow worse for my mother. People began murmuring to each other in low, uncomfortable tones. A few of my grandparents' oldest friends, People who had known Eleanor and Walter for 60 years exchanged looks that I recognized immediately as recognition, as if some private confirmation had just landed for them too, some suspicion about my mother they'd carried privately for years and never voiced. An older woman near the front, a friend of my grandmother's named Dottie, who used to bring rhubarb pie to every summer barbecue at the lake house, stood up from her table and said, loud enough for half the room to hear, Eleanor told me years ago she was taking care of that house properly. I always wondered what she meant. My mother's face went a shade paler. I handed the microphone back to the event planner, who looked deeply unsure what to do with it, and I turned to Grace. I think we're done here, I said. Grace nodded, closed her folio, and we walked off the small stage together, down the 3 steps, back through the round tables, past 240 faces that had spent the last 4 minutes watching my mother's carefully built performance dissolve into something much closer to the truth. Theo met me halfway across the room and put his arm around me without saying anything, which was exactly what I needed. We didn't stay for the rest of the event. We collected our coats, thanked the few relatives who caught our eye on the way out, and left the Winmore before the band even finished setting up for the dancing portion of the evening that, as far as I know, never actually happened, because the party essentially ended the moment we walked off that stage. If you've made it this far, I need you to know something, because I think it's the part people skip past in stories like this. I didn't feel triumphant walking out of that ballroom. I felt tired, in the specific way you feel tired after finally putting down something heavy you've been carrying for so long you forgot it had weight. If this resonates with you at all, drop a comment below, and if you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe, because what happened over the following weeks is honestly the part that surprised me the most. My phone started buzzing before we even got to the car. Texts, missed calls, a voicemail from my mother that I didn't listen to until the next morning. I want to walk you through what happened in the weeks that followed because I think it matters just as much as what happened on that stage. My mother called the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. I let most of them go to voicemail at first, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely needed a few days to process what had happened before I could talk to her, without either of us saying something we couldn't take back. When I finally did answer, on the 4th day, her opening line was, and I remember this precisely, "You humiliated me in front of the entire town, Vivian. Do you understand what you've done to my reputation?" Not an apology. Not a question about how I might have felt learning my inheritance had been publicly reassigned to my sister without a word to me. Just an accounting of the damage to her own image, delivered in the exact wounded tone she'd used my entire childhood whenever a consequence finally landed anywhere near her. "You tried to give away a house that's belonged to me for 9 years, Mom, in front of 240 people, without ever once asking me a single question about it," I said. "I didn't humiliate you. You did that yourself. I just happened to be the one holding the paperwork when it mattered." She didn't have a response for that. Not a real one, anyway. She cycled through a few familiar tactics, guilt about everything she'd sacrificed raising me, guilt about my father's blood pressure, a vague threat about consulting a lawyer of her own to look into the trust, which Grace later confirmed, when I mentioned it to her, would go absolutely nowhere given how airtight my grandparents had built it. 9 years of documentation. 2 separate attorneys involved over the life of the trust. A recorded deed. There was quite simply nothing left to contest. Chloe called me a week later, and that conversation went differently than I expected. She didn't apologize for the ballroom. Not exactly, but she did say something that told me the ground under her had genuinely shifted. "I didn't know, Viv. I want you to believe that. Mom told me it was a done deal, that the estate had settled, and it was coming to us." I never once thought to ask if that was actually true. I just believed her, the way I've always just believed her, because it's always been easier that way. "I believe you," I told her, and I meant it. Chloe's failure, if you want to call it that, was a failure of never having been given a reason to question the story she'd been handed her whole life. Mine was different. I'd had 36 years of reasons. "Can we talk sometime?" she asked. "Not about the house. Just actually talk. I feel like I don't really know what your life has even been like the last decade. We've started having lunch about once a month since then, just the 2 of us, no parents involved. It's slow going, and I'm not going to pretend it's fixed everything between us, but it's real in a way our relationship hasn't been in a very long time, and I'm grateful for it. My father called about 10 days after the event, and this was honestly the conversation I didn't expect to matter as much as it did. He didn't defend my mother. He didn't ask me to reconsider anything. He just said quietly, I should have asked more questions over the years, Vivian. About a lot of things. I let your mother handle things because it was easier than pushing back, and I think somewhere along the way that meant I let her handle you, and Chloe unfairly too.
I'm sorry.
I don't expect that to fix anything overnight. It didn't fix everything overnight. But it was the first time in my adult life my father had said the word sorry to me without immediately following it with a reason it wasn't really his fault, and I've chosen to let that count for something. My mother, for her part, has not apologized. Not once, not in any form, not in the 4 months since that ballroom. She's told a version of the story to a few remaining loyalists in her circle in which I made a scene at what should have been a beautiful family celebration, in which I embarrassed her over what she describes as a paperwork technicality. I've heard this secondhand, through my aunt, through Chloe. I don't correct it anymore. I've learned over the last several years that some stories aren't worth fighting for airtime, especially when the actual documentation already tells the truth clearly enough that anyone who wants to know can find it. About 2 weeks after the ballroom, my mother made one more attempt, and I think it's worth walking through because it tells you almost everything you need to know about how she operates.
She didn't call this time.
She showed up at our house on a Saturday morning, unannounced, in a car I didn't recognize, borrowed from a friend I later learned so that I wouldn't see her name on my phone, and let it go to voicemail. She stood on our porch in a wool coat, holding a tote bag, and when I opened the door she smiled at me like nothing had happened, like 4 months hadn't passed since a ballroom full of people watched her lose control of a story she'd spent years writing. I brought some of your grandmother's old recipe cards, she said, holding out the tote bag like a peace offering. I thought you might want them for the lake house kitchen. I want to be honest about how tempting it was to just take the bag, invite her in, let the conversation slide into something easier, because some old, tired part of me still wanted, even after everything, for this to be the moment where my mother finally said the thing I'd been waiting to hear my entire life. I stood in that doorway for a long moment, and I thought about the porch at Miller's Ridge, and the guest book, and the letter my grandmother left me, and I made myself ask the only question that actually mattered. Did you come here to apologize, Mom? She blinked, and something in her face shifted, not toward softness, but toward the particular defensiveness she reaches for whenever she's asked to account for herself directly instead of managing an audience. I came here to bring you your grandmother's recipes, Vivian. I don't understand why everything has to be a confrontation with you now. It doesn't have to be a confrontation, I said. It just has to be honest. You told 240 people that house belonged to you to give away. You never once, in 9 years, asked me a single question about what I wanted, or what those summers meant to me, or whether I even knew the trust existed before you decided to stand on a stage and hand it to Chloe. I'm not asking for a scene, Mom. I'm asking for one sentence. I was wrong. She stood there on my porch for a long time, tote bag still extended slightly between us, and I watched her search for the sentence and fail to find it, the same way she'd failed to find it in that ballroom, the same way she'd failed to find it in every phone call since. Finally, she said, quieter than I'd ever heard her, I thought I was doing right by this family. That's not the same thing, I told her. And I think somewhere in you already know that. She left about 10 minutes later, recipe cards still in the tote bag, because I didn't take them that day. Not out of spite. I just wasn't ready yet to let something so intimate come to me wrapped in an unfinished conversation. She hasn't brought them back since, and I haven't asked for them. I imagine, someday, once there's an actual apology on the table instead of a substitute for one, I'll ask Chloe to bring them to lunch instead. There was a family group chat that had existed for years, mostly used for coordinating holidays and sharing photos of my cousin's kids, and in the days after the ballroom it briefly became something else entirely, a battlefield of half-informed relatives weighing in on a situation most of them had only heard secondhand. My Aunt Denise, my mother's younger sister, was the first to break ranks publicly, sending a message that read, in part, I always wondered why Mom and Dad were so careful about who they let handle things toward the end. Now I understand. My mother left the chat entirely 3 days later, not in a dramatic public exit, just quietly, the way you slip out a side door when a party stops being fun. Nobody commented on it. Everybody noticed. Preston, Chloe's husband, sent me a single, oddly formal text about a week after the event, which I've thought about more than I probably should. It read, "I want you to know I had no idea the title situation was unresolved. I would never have let Chloe stand up there if I'd understood the paperwork wasn't settled. I hope there are no hard feelings toward her or toward the baby." I appreciated it, genuinely, even though the phrase unresolved paperwork was doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence to avoid the word my mother lied. I wrote back that there were no hard feelings toward Chloe or the baby, and I meant it. My nephew was born the following spring, and I drove up to the hospital with a gift the same week and held him, and felt something in my chest ease a little further, the way it does when you realize the next generation gets a chance to start this particular ledger clean. Grace still checks in periodically, mostly just to confirm the annual trust filings, the property tax payments, which Theo and I now handle directly, and without any confusion about whose name is actually on the deed. We spent a weekend at the lake house about a month after the ballroom, just the two of us, no extended family, no drama. I sat on that porch in the same chair my grandmother used to sit in, and I watched the light turn that particular shade of gold. It only holds for about 20 minutes before dropping behind the tree line. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself feel something close to peace instead of vigilance. I found the old guest book in the hall closet that weekend, the leather one my grandmother made everyone sign since 1962. I sat with it for a long time, flipping through decades of handwriting, dates, little notes people had left. Near the very back, in my grandmother's small, tidy cursive, dated the same week she first walked into Grace Whitfield's office 9 years earlier, there was an entry I'd never noticed before, tucked among ordinary guest signatures like it was hiding in plain sight. It read, "Reserved for Vivian, who has always understood that a home is something you tend, not something you take."
Everything else follows from that.
I added my own entry beneath it that weekend. The first time I'd written that note was something other than a guess. I didn't take a photo of it. I don't think it needs to be shared beyond this house. Some things are just for the people who actually show up. I think a lot about the difference between the two documents that matter most in this story. There was the giant novelty check, printed on flimsy poster board, handed over under a spotlight with 240 people clapping, designed entirely to be seen and believed in a single dramatic instant. And there was the trusting script of my grandma's, typed in plain 12-point font, sitting quietly in a filing cabinet in Grace Whitfield's office for 9 years, never once even acknowledged. One of those documents was built to inform ownership. The other one actually was ownership. I think that's the whole story, if I'm honest, distilled down to 2 pieces of paper in the same room at the same moment, and only one of them survived contact with the truth. I've also thought a lot about my grandmother's patience, the sheer, deliberate patience it must have taken to sit across from an attorney 9 years before any of this happened and plan, in careful, unemotional legal language, for a moment she would never live to see. She didn't do it out of spite toward my mother, not really, even though I understand why it might read that way from the outside. I think she did it because she'd spent 60 years watching her daughter learn to treat love as a limited resource to be rationed strategically, and she couldn't undo that lesson. But she could make absolutely certain it never got the chance to cost me the one piece of this family that had always felt unconditional. That's not spite. That's the clearest form of love I've ever personally witnessed, and it took me most of a decade to fully understand it. Theo asked me recently, sitting on that same porch on a quiet Sunday evening with the lake gone that particular shade of orange gold, whether I thought my mother would ever actually change, whether there was some future version of the story where she finally said the sentence I'd been waiting my whole life to hear. I told him I didn't know, and that I'd stopped organizing my life around finding out. That felt like the real ending of the story, more than the ballroom, more than the deed, more than any of it. Not a triumphant confrontation, but the quiet, unremarkable decision to stop waiting for someone to become a different person before you let yourself be happy in the life you've already built. Here's what I want you to take from this, if you take anything at all. My mother spent years believing that authority over people, and over what belongs to them, could be manufactured through performance, through a stage, through a crowd of 240 witnesses primed to applaud whatever story she told them. What she never understood, what I don't think she's understood even now, is that the truth doesn't need an audience to be true. It just needs someone to eventually stand up and say it clearly with the paperwork to back it up, in whatever room happens to be listening. My grandparents didn't leave me that house because I was their favorite in some simple, sentimental sense. They left it to me because I was the one who kept showing up long after showing up stopped being convenient, long after there was any guarantee it would ever be noticed or rewarded. Family, real family, isn't the people who hand you a giant novelty check in front of an audience. It's the people who spend 9 quiet years making sure nobody can ever take away what actually belongs to you. That's my story. If someone in your life has ever tried to decide, publicly or privately, what you deserve without ever asking you a single question about it, I want to hear it. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one of them, and I think you'd be surprised how many people carry some version of this. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love to have you here for the next one. I'll see you in the next story.